Namaskar, Dr. K Tiwari here once again in the series of lectures on literary theory, and my today's topic is Russian formalism. And as you know that this is the third lecture on literary theory, Russian formalism. Here are two things. First is Russian and second is formalism. Formalism means form is more important than content, and Russian means the theory was evolved, it developed, and it came into being in Russia. That's why it is called Russian formalism. What is the basic tenets of Russian formalism, and who were the basic components, who were the basic critics of this Russian formalism? Where was it developed, and from which country it moved to which country? Right, it was obviously developed in Russia in Moscow and then St. Petersburg, and from St. Petersburg and Moscow during the 1930s when they were suppressed here by the Soviet forces, they fled, they left Russia and went to a different country, and they started there a different school, and that different school was called Prague Linguistic Circles. So in today's lecture you are going to have information on all these points. Be attentive, and if you think that the information that I am going to deliver will be helpful, then you have to pay your proper attention to the entire class, as the topic is very important for your examination. Alright, first let's start with the introduction. Russian formalism, it means it was started in Russia in 1920s in Moscow, in St. Petersburg. Right, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in the 20th century's second decade. Alright, point number one. The opponents of the movement, Russian formalism, they originally described formalism in very derogatory way, but when formalist critics, when Russian formalists became famous, they changed their mind, and now formalism is taken as a positive term. It is not a derogatory term. Point number two. Next point, when this critical mode was suppressed by the Soviets in the early 1930s, the center of the formalist study of literature moved to Czechoslovakia, where it was continued especially by members of the Prague Linguistic Circles, from MLC, Moscow Linguistic Circles, to PLC, Prague Linguistic Circle, right, which included Roman Jakobson, who immigrated from Russia, Jan Mukarovsky, and Renevalek and Mr. Jakobson, they were professors in different universities there. Right, so this was the introduction. Let's see what is formalism. Formalism views literature as a special form of language. Formalist critics or formalists believe that literature is a special form of language. It is a specified form of language. Right, though it consists of language, it is made of language, but Russian formalists think that there are two types of languages. There are two types of languages that is used by common man, everyday language, and the basic purpose of everyday language is to communicate message, is to converse, communicate information. But the purpose of literature, the purpose of the language that is used in literature, its purpose is not to provide you information, but to foreground. Let's say it conceives that the central function of ordinary language is to communicate. Central function of ordinary language is to communicate to auditors a message or information by references to the world existing outside of language. In contrast, it conceives literary language to be self-focused. What is literary language? Literary language does not convey information. It is not used for conveying things, but it is self-focused. In that, its function is not to give information. Its function is not to convey information by making extrinsic references. Extrinsic criticism and intrinsic criticism, there are two types of criticism, as I had told you in my first lecture on new criticism. Right, the language that we use daily, it uses extrinsic references to convey message, but when we talk about the language that is used in literature, it doesn't take anything from the outer world, but to offer the reader a special mode of experience. Right? Literary language offers the reader a special mode of experience by drawing attention to its formal features. And what are the formal features? That is, to the qualities and internal relations of the linguistic science themselves. The language of literature is limited to itself, and the language of communication is not limited. Language of communication has to take with extrinsic affairs, extrinsic things, but the language that we use in literature, it is a special form of language and it is limited to literature only. It doesn't go out of literature. It is used, it offers the reader a special mode of experience by drawing attention to its formal features. And the formal features means the qualities and internal relations of the linguistic science themselves. All right. After the very definition of formalism, the linguistics of literature differs from the linguistics of the practical discourse. Linguistics of literature means the language of literature is very much different from the language of communication, from the language of daily discourse, because its laws are oriented toward producing the distinctive feature that formalists called literariness. Here is a word that is very important, literariness. Right? The language of literature creates literariness. The language of literature creates literariness, and this literariness makes a difference between everyday use of language and literary language, and this very term has been used here, defamiliarization. Right? Defamiliarization का काम होता है तो language literariness बनती है. As Roman Jakobson wrote in 1921, the object of study in literary science is not literature but literariness. That is what makes a given work a literary work. Right now, Roman Jakobson talks about literary science, and what is to be studied in literary science. Roman Jakobson says that the object of study in literary science is not literature but literariness. That is what makes a given work a literary work. What is literariness? Literariness was a special use of everyday language. It was the effect of the formal and linguistic properties of a text, and the purpose of criticism was to discover these underlying properties. The purpose of criticism is to discover the underlying properties so that you could discover the literariness. And the object of literature, the object of study in literary science is not literature but literariness. Right? And in order to get that literariness, a critic explores that literariness. A critic has to discover these underlying properties to get the literariness. Alright, you have to defamiliarize yourself from the everyday language, from the daily language, and once you defamiliarize, and the language that is used in literature, the language that is called literariness, right? Literariness is not a simple thing, it is a very intrinsic material, and that intrinsic material has to be explored, right, in order to get literariness. Alright. What are the key assumptions of formalist critics? Formalism. Literature, especially poetry, was a special function of language. Point number one. Literature was a special function of language, and initially formalistic critics focused on poetry only. It was possible to discover the underlying formula or structures of literary texts by a study of its devices. Right? By a study of its devices, a term they were fond of using to describe literary techniques such as symbolism. By using literary techniques such as symbolism, you can find that underlying formula, underlying structures. Right? Once again, you are here learning about structuralism. Literary analysis could be as accurate and precise as science. There is no difference between science and literature. Literary analysis could be as accurate and precise as science if you are applying these theories, if you are applying these intrinsic values, if you are applying these devices in order to search the meaning, and in order to search the literariness. All right. Then there are two terms, foregrounding and backgrounding. What is foregrounding and what is backgrounding? The literariness of work, as Jan Mukarwski says, a member of the Prague linguistic circle के member है, and he says that the literariness of work consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. Maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. That is the foregrounding, the act of expression, the act of speech itself. What is foregrounding? To foreground is to bring something into the highest prominence, to make it dominant in perception, right? To make something sublime, right? To uplift something. To foreground is to bring something into the highest prominence. To foreground means to bring something into the highest prominence, to make it dominant in perception. Once again, read the line of Jan Mukarwski. The literariness of work. Where do we find literariness? The literariness of work consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. Maximum of foregrounding of the utterance, that is the foregrounding of the act of expression, the act of speech itself. Act of expression, act of speech itself. To foreground is to bring something into the highest prominence, to make it dominant in perception. And then he contradicts by the word background. Foreground, background. By background, the referential aspect and the logical connections in language. Poetry makes the words themselves palpable as phonic signs. Right? What does backgrounding do? Backgrounding. By backgrounding the referential aspects of the logical connections in language, poetry makes the words themselves palpable as phonic signs. So foregrounding is very important, as the Mr. Jan Mukarwski says, that the foregrounding, the literariness of the work consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. Utterance means speech, right? Whatever you speak, that is called, whatever you utter is called utterance, right? And the literariness of a work consists in the maximum of foregrounding of speech itself. Maximum of foregrounding of the utterance, that is foregrounding of the act of expression, the act of speech itself, right? To make it sublime. And the primary aim of literature in thus foregrounding its linguistic medium, as Victor Shklovsky put it in an influential formulation, is to estrange or defamiliarize. Defamiliarize, that is by disrupting the modes of ordinary linguistic discourse. Literature makes strange the world of everyday perception and renews the reader's lost capacity for fresh sensation. Right? What a literary man does. A literary man makes the language different, makes the language defamiliar, makes the language strange from the normal language, from the common language, from the language spoken by common men. He makes a difference. He defamiliarizes language from the language of the common man, as Victor Shklovsky says that it is called defamiliarization, and defamiliarization is one of the ways to get literariness, as foregrounding is also one of the ways to get literariness. foregrounding the term was discussed by Jan Mukarowski, and defamiliarization, the word was discussed by Mr. Victor Sklosky, and literariness, the term was coined by whom? Roman Jakobson. So you have to remember the words and their coinage, right, and their proponents, so that in your examination you could tally the name with the concepts, right? Roman Jakobson's literariness, John Mukarowski's term, right, foregrounding, and then Victor Sklosky's term, defamiliarization, right? How do we create defamiliarization? Victor Sklosky put it in an influential formulation, is to estrange or defamiliarize, that is, by disrupting the modes of ordinary linguistic discourse, right? The mode of ordinary linguistic discourse is to be disrupted in order to get what? In order to get defamiliarization, that is, by disrupting the modes of ordinary linguistic discourse, literature makes strange the world of everyday perception, renews the reader's lost capacity for fresh sensation. And if you remember, once Mr. Samuel Taylor Coleridge had also discussed this point of a fresh sensation, and here Victor Sklosky is also in favor of fresh sensations, and it is the duty of the writer, it is the duty of a literary man to make a bit difference, right? Mr. Wordsworth had said that poetry should be written in the language of common men, and if poetry is written in the language of common men, then there will be no defamiliarization, right? And then Mr. Samuel Taylor Coleridge disagrees with Mr. Wordsworth, and only on this ground he contradicted Wordsworth's theory of poetry, right, that Wordsworth had propounded in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, right? Mr. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote his literary autobiography, Biographia Literaria, and in Biographia Literaria he went against Wordsworth's theory of poetry, that poetry should be written in the language of common man, poet should be a man speaking to men. Mr. Coleridge says no, there must be difference, and even Wordsworth himself was making the difference. He was not writing in the language of common men, he himself was against his theory, he was prophesying something else and practicing something else. Victor Sklosky says that we need to create a bit difference, right? We need to create a defamiliar language, that is a strange language from common day language, from the everyday language, right? So that the word of everyday perception, and it could renew the reader's lost capacity for fresh sensations. Let's see what was the difference between Samuel Taylor Coleridge and these formalist theorists. In Biographia Literaria, 1817, Samuel Taylor Coleridge had long ago described the prime merit of literary genius to be the representation of familiar objects so as to evoke freshness of sensation. But whereas the romantic critic had stressed the author's ability to express a fresh mode of experiencing the world, the formalist stresses the function of purely literary devices to produce the effect of freshness in the reader's experience of a literary work. Right? Samuel Taylor Coleridge had made emphasis on poet. A poet should use such language so that he could create a freshness, he could create a fresh sensation. But here formalist critics do not focus on poets, but in fact they focus on devices to get the literariness, right? Next point after Samuel Taylor Coleridge, now Mr. Jakobson once again. The foreground properties are artistic devices which strange poetic language are often described as deviations from ordinary language, right? You have to deviate from ordinary language to create defamiliarization from ordinary language. Such deviations, which are analyzed most fully in the writings of Roman Jacobson, consist primarily in setting up and also violating patterns in the sound and syntax of poetic language, including patterns in speech sound, grammatical constructions, rhythm, rhyme, stanza forms, and also in setting up prominent recurrences of keywords or images. This is the picture of Roman Jacobson. To foreground, the foregrounded properties are artistic devices, and if you apply artistic devices anywhere, it means you are deviating from the normal path. You are deviating from the well-trodden path. Deviate आप हो रहे हैं from a deviation from ordinary language. Such deviations, which are analyzed most fully in the writings of Roman Jacobson, consist primarily in setting up and also violating patterns in the sound and syntax of poetic language, including patterns in speech sounds, grammatical constructions, rhythm, rhyme, and stanza form, and also in setting up prominent recurrences in the keywords or images. And this is the way of communication. This is the model of communication as was suggested by Roman Jacobson. Model of communication, right? Russian words, expressive means addressor, and destinataire, conative means addressee. Context, message, contact, and code. This is the method of communication, model of communication according to Mr. Roman Jacobson. Right, this is Roman Jacobson's model of communication. Let's see it in a very elaborate form now. According to Mr. Roman Jacobson's narrative communication, all speech communication involves these 6 elements. All speech communication involves these 6 elements, and the process can be described as narrative communication. What are the 6 elements of a narrative technology, narrative communication according to Roman Jacobson? Addresser, number 1, addresser, addressee, message, contact, code, and context. These are the 6 elements. All speech communication involve these 6 elements, and the processes can be described as narrative communication. Let's take an actual example. Suppose I write in a letter to a friend who live in a different town in the following sentence. I work in a university that is at a distance of 12 kilometers from my home, and this slide is taken from P.K. Nair's book. Pramod Kumar Nair's book. He gives this example to clarify the 6 elements of Mr. Roman Jacobson's theory of narrative communication. I work in a university at a distance of 12 kilometers from home. This is the sentence. Here, addressee is myself. I have spoken. I am addressee. And addressee, to whom I addressing, I am writing to my friend. My friend is addressee. What is the message? The message I am conveying is I work here in a university that is at a distance of 12 kilometers. This is the entire message. What is the contact? The method, right? Mode of communication. Here I am writing a letter. Yeah, I could have WhatsApp. I could have send message through any medium. Contact, the letter, handwritten or email. And then the code. Code is the writing that I have written, and then when my friend would find the letter, he would decode. That is context. The language used in the writing, both of us understand them. These are the 6 elements of communication, 6 elements of narrative communication according to Mr. Roman Jakobson. Right, Roman Jakobson's theory of model of communication was based on these 6 elements. Right, and these 6 elements are destination, context, message, contact, referential, poetic, fatigue, and metalinguistics, that is code. Right, each of us, whoever are participating in communication, they must know the same language so that they could understand each other. Right, mode of communication. And then metaphor and metonymy. Right, Mr. Jakobson says that to get the literariness, you have to use either metaphor or metonymy. Metaphor and metonymy both are the figure of speech of substitution. Jakobson argued that all meaning in poetic language is the result of metonymic combinations, syntagm, the horizontal, organizational as a sentence, and metaphoric selections, paradigm, the choice of one term from a collection of terms. In communication, the meaning of the message is based on which of the 6 elements, code, address, addressee, message, contact, context, is dominant. Right, in communication, the meaning of the message is based on which element, which of the 6 element is dominant, which of the 6 element is dominant, and which of the 6 elements are code, address, addressee, message, contact, and context. Right, and meaning lies in the dominant feature according to Mr. Roman Jakobson. And Jakobson says that to get defamiliarization, to get literariness, you have to use metaphor and metonymy. These 2 figures of speeches, these both are almost same, can get literariness. Right, Roman Jakobson's. And then these are the people, these are the members of Moscow Linguistic Circle, MLS. Moscow Linguistic Circle के these are the members. Right, the Moscow MLC, Moscow Linguistic Circle. The Moscow Linguistic Circle was founded in 1915. That was the 2nd decade of the 20th century, as I already told you, by a group of linguists led by Nikolai Trubetskoy and Roman Jakobson. Roman Jakobson was affiliated with the movement from the beginning. Right, Trubetskoy and Jakobson, along with other members such as Sergei Karsvesky, Vyacheslav Ivanov, and Boris Eichenbaum, formed the core of the circle. They aimed to promote the study of language as a structured system and focused on phonology, morphology, and syntax. The year 1915 is very important. This was the year when Ferdinand Saussure's course in general linguistics was published posthumously. Right, he had also found the structure, the basis of everything is the structure. And here the Moscow Linguistic Circle, they were also aiming to promote the study of language. Right, they were aiming to promote the study of language as a structured system and focused on phonology, morphology, and syntax. Right, Ferdinand de Saussure focused on difference, signifier and signified. And here the French linguists, the Moscow linguists, they focused on phonology, morphology, and syntax. One of the key principles of the Moscow Linguistic Circle was the rejection of the diachronic approach to language study. Ferdinand de Saussure also rejected the diachronic study, historical development of meaning. He had also rejected, and MLC, Moscow Linguistic Circles, also rejected the diachronic approach to language study, which emphasizes historical development and change. Instead, the circle advocated the synchronic study, synchronic approach, examining language as it exists in a particular situation in a particular time. This perspective influenced their structuralist framework, which emphasized the interrelations of linguistics elements within a system, and this is from witcritic.com. And from MLC, when they were suppressed, they fled, भाग खड़े हुए और भाग करके कहां पहुंचते हैं MLS भी सही है, मॉडर्न मॉस्को लिंग्विस्टिक स्कूल्स टू Prague schools. The Moscow Linguistic Circle had a significant impact on the field of linguistics, particularly in the development of phonological theory. Nikolai Terbutsky's work on phonology, known as the Prague School, greatly influenced the study of phonetics and phonology. Roman Jakobson, another prominent member of the circle, made significant contributions to the field of structural linguistics and semiotics, and his ideas continue to be influential today. The MLC dissolved in early 1920s due to political and ideological changes in the Soviet Union, but its members continued to have significant careers and influence in linguistics and related fields. The legacy of the Moscow linguistic circles can be seen in the broader development of structuralist and functionalist approaches in linguistics, as well as in the establishment of the Prague School as a major center of linguistic thought. MLS to PLS, then this is another school, short form of a school, Russian acronym created from Общество по изучению поэтического языка, Society for the Study of Poetic Language, right? Which along with the Moscow Linguistic Circle was one of the precursors group of Russian formalism. You have to remember the full form of the word of the acronym and what does it mean in English. In English it means Society for the Study of Poetic Language, which along with Moscow Linguistic Circle was one of the founders of Russian formalism. The group was formed in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1916 by a group of students and professors working in language studies. It was chaired by Osip Brick, and its membership included Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Echenbaum, and Roman Jakobson. Roman Jakobson is common. He was with Moscow Linguistic Circle, he was with Prague Linguistic Circle, he was with Opoyaz. He was with Opoyaz, means all forms of Russian formalism was incomplete without the influential intervention of Roman Jakobson. Roman Jakobson's literariness, Roman Jakobson's books, his thoughts about metaphor and metonymy. The group was interested in uncovering the working mechanisms of literary technique, or more precisely identifying the specifying quality of language use that separated the literary text from non-literary text. The group, never more than a loosely knit discussion unit and occasional cooperative publishing venture, folded in 1923 and merged with the Moscow Linguistic Circle, though by then many of its leading lights had already fled abroad, already fled America, already fled Czechoslovakia, right? They were not there. So it started in 1916 and it folded in 1923, right? It merged with Moscow Linguistic Circle. All right. Prague School. Closely aligned with Russian formalism is the Prague School of Structuralists. Roman Jakobson, a Russian immigrant, was one of the central figures of this school. The Prague School's central tenet was that language is coherent system fulfilling a range of functions in society. Jakobson's work on language built on this tenet. The Prague School believed that there was a poetic or aesthetic function of language. There was a poetic or aesthetic function of language. This is the belief of Roman Jakobson. Poetic language foregrounds its own use. It does not go ahead, but it foregrounds its use. This means poetic language does not seek to convey information. Instead, it draws attention to its own utterance, to what and how it is saying or is speaking. These are the main tenets of Russian formalism, and the main tenets of Russian formalism were also propounded by the Prague school, because the members of the Moscow linguistic circle, the members of the Prague linguistic circle, almost of them were same. Only the place is different from Moscow to Prague, but the basic tenets were the same. John Mukarovsky declared that the function of poetic language consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance that we have discussed earlier. It is not used in the service of communication, right? The language of literature is not used in the service of communication, but in fact it is used for foregrounding, right? The language of poetry foregrounds itself. It does not convey information. It is not used for communicative purposes. Communicative purposes के लिए we use common language, everyday language. Alright, poetic language is an end in itself. It does not seek to do more. Poetic language does end, right? It ends in itself. It does not seek to do more. This was the thought of Prague linguistic circle, and now people are going. Let's go. I hope you would have understood the main tenets, the main points of Russian formalism, and if you have understood properly, then please press the button of like, and you could share the video among your friends so they could get the benefit of the class and they could get through their examinations. And to help others is to help yourselves. Thank you so much. All the best. Good luck. We will meet soon with a new lecture, with a new video lecture. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Take care. All the best. Good luck.